Video we're going to be looking at subroutines, and we're going to be looking at a particular type of subroutine called a function. So a subroutine is a block of code within a program that can be called at any time from the main program. A subroutine is just a block of code within a main program. It can be seen as a program within your program. So when you make your programs, you might break them down into lots of subprograms or subroutines. And a function is a type of subroutine that takes parameters and returns a value to the main program. It takes parameters and it returns a value. So the difference between a function and a procedure, which is the other type of subroutine, is that a function returns a value. It returns a value. So we run our main program then runs a subroutine, and if that subroutine is a function, it will return a value to our main program. And finally, a parameter is just a variable that a subprogram requires in order to run. It's only defined in the subprogram, but its values are passed as arguments from the main program. We're going to be looking at this in more detail in the next slide. So there are a lot of parts to how a subroutine works and how a function works, and I recommend that you pause this video, take down notes, and on the next slide you can even go into Python and try and code the program up and see how it works yourself. So this is just an example using pseudocode, and I'm going to break down, I'm going to decompose each of the elements, and I'm going to abstract, I'm going to focus on the relevant details and hopefully help you to understand how functions work. So the first thing I'm abstracting, the first detail I'm focusing on is that you define your subroutine as a function before the main program. So this block of code here is actually my function, and I'm defining it before my main program. After I defined it, I need to name my function. I need to give my function a name. So I have my function defined and I'm naming it my subroutine name, okay? Please use more meaningful names than this. This is just as an example, right? And then I have brackets. I have a pair of brackets, and inside those brackets I have parameters, and these are values that are passed from my main program. So as said in the previous slide, my parameters are variables, and they contain values that are passed from my main program, and they'll be used within my subroutine. Now, once I've defined my subroutine, I will indent it. I'll indent it. So there's a dent, it's indented. And these are the instructions that are going to be executed. These are instructions that are going to be executed. So they might be multiple lines of instructions here. There could be if statements, for loops, lots and lots and lots of lines of code that are all executed when my subroutine is called. And finally, and most importantly, a function returns a value. So the last line in my function, returns a value to the main program. Now, that value will usually be a variable, and it's going to be within these brackets. So this line returns the result to the main program. Now, if we take a look, what actually happens is, when I'm running my program, it runs sequentially. So my program reads, okay, this is a function, this is a function's name, this is what this function does. But nothing happens. It only starts to work when I get into my main program. So this is my main program, and just as an example, I am assigning a value to a variable, and I've called this variable argument. And you'll see why in the next line. So once I write that subroutine's name, when I write the subroutine's name, the function is called. The function is called. So I'm calling my function, and I'm calling it to run. I'm calling it to run. And in the brackets here, I've actually got arguments. The values stored in my main program are passed to the function as arguments. So I'm just going to illustrate what's actually happening here. I have some values. Just as a normal variable assignment, they're being assigned to my variable argument. And these values now, whatever is stored inside argument, is actually being held here, where I'm about to call my subroutine. And what's going to happen is these values are going to be passed up into my parameters. So my argument is passed to my subroutine as parameters, and then these values are going to be used. These values are going to be used inside my subroutine. Once my subroutine is finished, I need to return value to main. So that's what this is here for. I need a variable to store the value returned from the function. So the value is returned to my main program and stored in my variable here. So just to go backly very quickly there, when I'm calling my function, I write its name. I might want to pass values as arguments to my function. And once that code is run, the values are returned to the variable. So I need to have a variable name where I can store the values that are returned from my function. So now I'm going to take a look at a real example, and you can try and code this up in Python, and the syntax should work correctly. And in our first part, we are looking at def, and def defines your subroutine as a function before the main program. So def just defines, def is short for define. And in this example, my subroutine is called sum. My subroutine is called sum, and it's a meaningful name because you're going to see why my function is called sum. And I have two parameters. I have two parameters that have been passed from my main program, num1 and num2. And this is a block of code that's going to be executed in my function. It's indented, so I know it's part of my function. And I'm going to say total equals num1 plus num2. So I'm just adding two numbers together. I'm finding the sum. I'm finding the sum of two numbers. And the result is going to be stored in total. Finally, this line returns the result to my main program. So I'm returning the result, I'm returning total to my main program. Now, this code hasn't actually run yet. I'm only just defining it. And now I actually go to my main program, and in my main program I can see a value is assigned to a variable. So I've got 5 is being assigned to number 1, 20 is being assigned to number 2. So I've just got two variables, and they're both being assigned a value. And now I'm going to call my function. I'm going to call my function by writing its name. So I literally write sum, and I want to pass some values to my function, and these values are known as arguments. These values are known as arguments. And you can see these values here are being stored inside these variables. These variables are being passed to my subroutine. They're being passed to my function as arguments. So these are all going up here. And you'll notice that my arguments actually have different names to my parameters, but the values that are contained inside are the same. So what's actually going to be inside here is 5, and what's going to be inside here is 20. And then when I run my function, 5 plus 20 is going to equal 25. 5 plus 20 is going to equal 25. So I'm going to return the total, which is holding the value 25. And of course, when I return my total to my main program, I need a variable to store that result. I need a variable to store that result returned from my function. So result now contains the value 25. Now, once I've called my function, and this code has all been executed, and the value has been returned to my main program continues as usual. And I may want to use the result in other code, in other instructions within my main program. So that is a very brief example of how a function works. And I recommend that you try and program it up and look at different examples and see how it works, because they're really useful. And just to give you a quick summary, a function is a block of code. It's a block of code, and you can reuse it, because once you've defined it, all you need to do is call its name. You start by defining the function. So if you get an exam question that asks you to write a function, you'll get 1 mark just for defining it, And you need to call your function at the bottom. So here where it says at the bottom, you need to call your function in your main program. Excuse my terrible writing. Call your function in your main program. And this technique is called decomposition. Subroutines are a great example of decompositions, because we're breaking down a bigger task. We're breaking down a bigger task into smaller tasks. We're breaking down a bigger task into smaller tasks that are easier to solve. And we can code each task individually as a procedure or as a function. So subroutines are a great example of decomposition. And you would have used decomposition in your coursework, where you broke down a large and complex problem into smaller subproblems, like a login page or a multiple choice quiz or reading and writing answers from a text file. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you found this useful, and I'll leave you with a slide as always for how you can use computational thinking and the constructs of programming to break down a problem and write an algorithm. Good luck with your exams tomorrow, Year 11s.